economics is one of these classic water cooler topics, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. We've obviously had, I'm going to say, an unprecedented year, but we also have a year ahead. So we're going to do kind of a classic year in review and then look where we're going as well. And to do this, I brought in one of the 5 regional economists for Oregon, Damon Runberg. As his name suggests, he is my older brother, and so I'm excited to be talking to him. But the one reason I love to talk to him is because his objective take on the numbers, but it's also his willingness to go deeper, which is kind of what all this show is about. So having said that, Damon, welcome to Beyond the Water Cooler.
Hey, thanks, brother. Happy to be here.
Good. Yeah. So we've obviously been, like I just said, it's been the overused term is unprecedented. But we want to go, what I want to know, in kind of talking to you is, as we look back to 2020, how, if it was truly bad, how bad was it? I think we get a feel, at least emotionally, that it was a bad year economically. But what I want to dive into a little bit deeper and want you to do for us is how bad was 2020?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think a lot of people have fond memories necessarily of 2020, unless you got, some special extra family time. But, the combination of stay-at-home orders and a pandemic, excess death, sickness, the economic catastrophe. I mean, it was a pretty brutal year. I don't think anyone will look fondly back on the year as a whole, at least on net. And yeah, so it was a bad year, and it was our first recession that we've had here in the United States, and we'll look back and find that it was a global recession as well. But it was our first recession we've had in well over 10 years. The global financial crisis that led to the Great Recession, the housing bubble bursting back in 2008, was the last recession that we had here experienced here in Oregon and across the nation. And so really the 2020, I'm calling this recession. I don't know if anyone else has coined it yet. I'm calling it the Great Lockdown is what I'm calling this recession. It's been our first recession after the longest expansion in U.S. history. So, whether or not there was a pandemic or not, any recession feels like a bad economic time, since it's been so long since we've experienced sort of the pain of high unemployment, job losses, et cetera.
How does this really differ by the numbers, I guess, from 2007, 2008? Because I think that's the recession that everyone has on top of their minds. And even though it's been, 13, 14 years, it does still feel top of mind.
Yeah, we all experience, so we're sort of creatures of recency bias, I think is the best way to think of it. And so we hear the word recession and we think, well, our experience of recession last time is what our experience of recession should be this time. And it is most definitely a very different recession. And even if we had thought back, I mean, we were relatively young in the dot-com bubble in 2001. But, if we thought back to even the last recession before the Great Recession, that looked very different, in fact, from what we saw in 2008. So recessions are inherently different from one another. And so to sort of expect there to be like a repeat of history for every recessionary shock is sort of unjustified. I wouldn't say it's been a couple hundred years since we've had an event like this. It's been about exactly 100 years. We had the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918. And so that's our next close example of what something like this looks like. And it is remarkable to see the consistency of what the employment impacts have been in this pandemic relative to that pandemic 100 years ago. Like you said, with the 2008 housing crisis, it was one that was sort of triggered by, we saw people sort of overextended. Debt loads were really high. There was this sort of sense that housing was an asset that would continually grow forever. And we found that, there was a lot of speculation in the housing market. And that speculation, when that bubble burst, a lot of people lost money. We also saw a lot of people losing jobs. And that sort of created this sort of death spiral where people could no longer pay for the mortgage because they lost the job. And they already had a really high mortgage. They overextended themselves. And so we saw mass foreclosures and short sales, distress sales. And then that led to just this huge depreciation in home values. And so we come to this pandemic recession, and people think to themselves, well, gosh, well, we have the high unemployment thing, which we had in the last recession, of people losing their jobs. And if you lose your job, clearly you are going to have a hard time paying for your housing expenses. So we presumably would start to see distressed home sales as people can't pay their mortgages, or at the very least try to offload those mortgages. And it turns out that did not happen, even though we all speculated that that would be the case, that this would be brutal for our housing industry, our housing market. And it has actually been the opposite. It's been the opposite for a variety of reasons, and I sort of apologize for narrating here. But one of the big reasons why this recession has been different in that regard is the federal government came in really quick, really hot and real heavy with the CARES Act. And it did a couple of things. The first thing it did was it boosted unemployment insurance. When you lose your job because the government tells you you need to stay at home and they close your industry down, they sure as heck better make you whole. And that is the CARES Act, for the most part, did that for a lot of people. It boosted unemployment insurance, that extra $600 a week. So the vast majority of folks who were on unemployment actually saw their earnings were relatively unchanged from when they were working, which is really important. So that meant that those individuals could continue to pay their mortgages, continue to pay those housing expenses, and so we didn't see the distressed homes happen. Another thing is that the unemployment really targeted our low-wage workers a lot worse than sort of the mid and upper tier workers, wage workers, which tend to be the ones that have homes in the first place, that have mortgages to lose. So these low-wage workers really, it's been devastating as far as the magnitude of unemployment, but ultimately they don't impact the housing, the real estate market nearly as much as if it had been targeting sort of those individuals who make 60, 70 grand or more out there on average. So the CARES Act is a big difference there. There's also been foreclosure moratoriums and forbearance extensions, all sorts of programs that have allowed housing to sort of continue to go without much issue. And then the other thing is there's been incredibly low supply, because what happens in the middle of a pandemic when you're told you need to stay home? You're probably not moving. And so there's been a dramatic reduction in geographic mobility this year. And when you have a lot fewer people moving, less churn, it means fewer houses on the market to sell in the first place. So the inventory is really, really low right now. And we can get into other things with like interest rates, whatnot, that are really affecting the demand side of housing. But as much as a lot of us economists thought that this recession was going to lead to some negative impacts on the housing market, it's been actually the complete opposite so far.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because we just got our December numbers on the real estate side, and our current, what we see as a healthy in Portland's market, a healthy inventory is about 3 months. December numbers revealed that inventory was currently at 0.8 months. So that's less than a third of kind of what a healthy or balanced market looks like. And the way I kind of tell both my buyers and sellers on different sides of that coin is, it's almost like musical chairs, where there's one chair but 3 people circling for that one chair, or in this case, that one property. So that's caused a lot of heavy demand, as you mentioned before. And I think it's good to hear that those programs work really well, and actually we're able to circumnavigate preemptively the pre-foreclosure and foreclosures that were obviously a huge issue in 2007, 2008. Now, one of the things kind of jumping off of that I want to hear and understand is there one kind of higher up metric that is the kind of the grading stick for an economy and for our state economy as well? And then either that, or is it kind of a combination of a variety of metrics? And if so, which ones do you mainly look at?
Yeah, I mean, generally we have 3 types of indicators that we look at in economics. There's what we call sort of lagging indicators, or indicators that tell us something about the past. that doesn't mean that they're not valuable. That just means that they're a reflection of something that happened, maybe months ago. There are coincident indicators. These are indicators that happen. So think of them as like real-time indicators. They tell us exactly what the market looks like today. And many of the housing indicators that you referenced there would be coincident indicators. Those ones that are sort of telling us about today. For instance, the housing supply number, how many months of inventory you might have in the market would be an example of that. That's not telling us about the past, and it's not giving us any insight into the future. It's just telling us what it is, what's the supply. By the way, so I live, for your listeners, I live over in Bend, and you had mentioned that you were at like just under a month of inventory in the Portland metro market. Here in Bend, I never seen these numbers before, quite this bad. Bend's known for having low inventory, but the last few weeks they've averaged somewhere around 4 days of inventory, which I didn't even know that they would even translate it into days of inventory. I've only ever seen it at months, and so to be at 4 days was like, okay, so that means we have no housing available. Is what that means.
Wow.
So then the third type of indicator are what we call leading indicators. These are ones that give us some insight into the future, that are maybe a little bit more crystal ball-y. The data itself isn't a crystal ball, as in it's fake data that is it's more that what we can interpret from the data tells us something about the future. So is any one of those better than the other? No, we look at all of them, and I think that all types of indicators are important. As far as lagging indicators, employment, I think, is by far the most important one we should pay attention to. It's sort of the highest quality data that exists. Also, we can drill down at really specific levels, so we can see, where there's significant job losses. For instance, if we see, I might actually share a graphic here. So employment is, like I said, it's probably the most important indicator as far as lagging indicators that I like to focus on. I'm a labor economist, so maybe I'm biased in that regard. But it is really gives us the magnitude of movement we see in the economy more broadly. And so here you can see, for instance, this is just employment looking at sort of the year of 2020. So where have employment levels through the year as a percentage of what they were back in January, the beginning of the year. And you can see in Oregon here, the orange line, we lost nearly 15% of all jobs, total non-farm jobs in the state, which is just a mind-boggling number of jobs to lose. And we have seen really sustained continuous improvement through the summer and the fall. But you could really notice the sort of the tapering down or the slowdown in the improvement the last few months, and as we moved into the fall and winter months there. In fact, we just recently released the December 2020 numbers, which nationwide, they're pretty much flat. But here in Oregon, we actually saw pretty sizable job losses. Over 35,000 jobs were lost in December as a result of the increase, the spike in the COVID cases, as well as the public health measures to slow the spread of the disease. So this to me, this sort of graphic here, looking at employment, total non-farm employment, is by far the most important indicator to pay attention to for knowing how the market is doing, how our economy is doing more broadly, because the economy is the exchanging of goods and resources. And how do we exchange goods and services and buy resources and trade resources? Well, we do that through money. And we get money by working. And so this is sort of the core nexus. This is the most important thing we need to pay attention to, because you can't buy a house if you don't have a job, and you can't get groceries if you don't have a job. And so we're going to be really focused on this as far as measuring when we're getting out of the woods. But like I said, there are other, sort of leading and coincident indicators that are also really important. But I'd say employment's the one that we should really pay attention to.
Got it. And so looking kind of back at that graph, you were saying the United States was about 93, maybe 94%, and then Oregon was closer to 91, 92. Therefore, would you say Oregon was hit harder than the nation as a whole?
Yeah, definitely. We were hit harder. Not initially. The actual COVID shock was almost identical. You could see sort of in the April number there, they overlap almost identically. So that initial shock was the same. We've seen that for the most part, nationally, the numbers have improved at a faster pace than they have here in Oregon. that likely has to do with the fact, not that COVID has been worse here, but we've actually had some more stringent COVID restrictions across the state of Oregon. And that's not a bad thing, because our COVID numbers have been amongst the best in the nation, in fact. So uh, this is always a challenge when you're talking about public health policies. So the absence of doing something. So you could do something that leads to some economic damage, like having some of these COVID restrictions. However, you could also be preventing excess death, and death is also economically costly if you think about it that way. And so it's too soon to know if, like, the number of lives that we have saved in Oregon by our stricter public health measures may actually lead to stronger economic outcomes in the long run, even though it looks right here like we've had a slower recovery. So I I am reluctant to say we've been hit much harder than the nation, because I'd say it's ultimately too soon to tell. I think we'll make that statement or that judgment here in a few years when we look back on this.
Got it. Well, I think that's a good segue, Damon, to kind of, now that we've kind of reviewed where we've been, let's fast forward a little bit and just say, where are we going, and kind of where are those you know indicating figures pointing us to, and I saw one chart a little while ago, just the dramatic spike that this recession was compared to last one. But I also saw that it's expected to improve much more readily. Is that something that you would agree with?
Yeah, definitely. And let's see, we could probably look at, let's go to, there's a few of the coincident indicators that I think are really important for sort of answering that question. Like, how quickly are we going to get out of the woods here? Are we going to see a rapid recovery? Because remember, our last recession, it was incredibly deep, especially here in Oregon, and it was long lasting. And it took us a long time to completely recover. Ultimately, there's a few things that we want to pay attention to for when we talk about, like, recovering from a recession. Like I said, jobs are the most important thing, because without a job, you can't spend money. And then spending money is how the economy churns. That's how it runs. And so the more money that's spent, the more exchange of goods and services, the more economic activity we have, GDP increases, and that sort of gets us out of the recession woods, if you will. Personal consumption is a great coincident indicator for us to sort of get an idea of what is it going to take to recover from this recession. This is an interesting indicator, though, in the sense that you see this massive drop right here. So in April, you see personal consumption dropped over 16.5% nationwide from the previous year, from what it was in 2019. That's a huge drop. And you might assume here that this drop in consumption, this drop in spending, was because people were unemployed. But remember, we talked about the CARES Act and how it made most people whole. They got full wage replacement. So the lack of spending wasn't because of the high unemployment. The lack of spending, for the most part, was because people could not engage with the economy because they were staying at home, right? I couldn't take my daughter to the movies. I couldn't go with my wife in August to our 10-year anniversary trip to France. So I couldn't spend thousands of dollars to airlines, who are, by the way, struggling right now. So we had our personal household consumption way down from where we expected it to be. And that's the case all across the country. So for us to get back to, a normalcy, but get back to recovered, we have to get our consumption back to normal. So that means to increases in hiring, right? The more I spend, the more it puts demand for a particular good or service, which means they've got to, if I go to a restaurant again, then they got to hire the wait staff back. They got to hire more cooks and line cooks, et cetera. So this is one we're going to pay attention to, is consumption, and it has improved markedly from what it was back in April. But you can see it's still down right now, and it actually has stopped improving. It went backwards in November, and it's gonna, when the December numbers come out, those are going to be down even further. So once again, this recovery goes as COVID goes, and until we completely manage this health crisis, we can't expect to see sort of a recovery anytime soon. That being said, I think it's important for us to understand that this is likely going to be one of the fastest recoveries we've seen from a recession, despite how severe the job losses were, because we have sort of this the silver bullet that's sitting literally going in people's arms as we speak right now. There are effective and safe vaccines that are being administered, and they will continue to be at a relatively fast pace. It might feel slow knowing that the general public might not get it till May, but knowing that for as much time as we've dealt with COVID, to be able to just wait a few more months to get a vaccine is really encouraging. And once we get up to herd immunity again and people can engage the economy, there is a significant amount of pent up demand where we're going to see people really excited to spend money again. In fact, another thing sort of worth showing is the savings rate. So if we look at, there we go. If we look at the savings rate, for instance, it looks kind of mind-boggling here. This is insane.
Wow.
You see this green line on the far right here, where the rate went to sort of unprecedented levels that we've never seen before. That's a few things. The savings rate would increase because personal consumption went down, right? We just talked about it. I couldn't go to France for my 10-year anniversary trip. So instead of spending that money, it's now still in my checking account. So my savings rate went up. But we also had the stimulus that came in at that same exact moment. So the stimulus is a reflection of that increase in savings rate. And if you can see the most recent numbers here only through November. So we don't even have the second stimulus package that has come in since then. So the savings rate, it has been dropping, but it's going to jump up again because all these people got the $600 checks in their checking account here recently. So there's money literally burning a hole in people's pockets right now that they're excited to spend. They just need to be able to safely and freely spend that money.
Right. So the kind of the hope is obviously we just kind of essentially need to get to May, and people are looking forward to being able to, whether it's May or whether it's June, let's not get married to a certain date. But essentially you're saying people are excited to get back out and to get spending again, and that's going to get the wheels turning again, driving the belief that this is going to be a quicker recovery than past ones. When you say quicker, what timeline do you have in mind for what quicker means? Is it a year? Is it 3? Is it 5?
Yeah, good question. It's not a year. It's more than that. I think that by the end of this summer, by the time we move into the fall of 2021, I think that we will likely, my anticipation is that we'll feel normal. Like the economy will feel back to normal to some extent. You'll be able to go to restaurants. You'll be able to travel. Flying won't be super weird. I think that will all feel better, but it's going to take a longer time than we realize to dig out from the job losses. Like I said, we're still sitting as of December with a hole in the size of our labor market. 9% of all non-farm jobs are still missing in the labor market. So the good news is that most of those jobs that have been lost have been classified as temporary layoff. Mm-hmm. So they're still what we call sort of employer attached. So they're still, if they might work for a restaurant, they're still in contact with their employer, that restaurant, and they're ready to jump back into the workforce as soon as they're called back to work. That's great because that makes the recovery really quick, right? The concern is that behind the scenes, the dramatic improvement we've seen in temporary folks being called back to work is masking an ever increasing growth in the number of people classified on permanent layoff. We are seeing structural and permanent damage to the economy with permanent business closures, mostly in the leisure sector, a lot of restaurants, for instance. And for every permanent job lost, that's where it takes a lot longer to get those people back to work. Because like I said, if you're not attached to your employer, you've got to go through the hiring process. You got to find a job ad, you've got to apply for it, et cetera. And you really need more or new firms to be created in order to make up for the firms that were lost from a labor perspective. So my timeline, I would anticipate that here in Oregon, sometime in 2022, it might get close to being recovered fully from an employment perspective. But the recessionary feel, I think we won't feel like we're in a recession by sort of, the end of third quarter 2021. Once again, this pandemic rules the direction of this recovery and how fast we go. So we, as the community, as people, can do our best to help stop the spread, and I think that is going to help get us to this finish line faster, because the less COVID spreading we have, the lower the restrictions can be. And also, and then you combine that with the vaccines rolling out really quickly, we have hope on the horizon, I think is something to take away.
Got it. Okay. Well, we appreciate your time, Damon. Before we wrap up, one thing I like to do on this show is to really kind of give a shout out to the community and make what I call a community connection, which is essentially, I'd love to hear just a local business that you would recommend to our viewers. Could be a restaurant, could be a golf course, could be a salon. What is your community connection, Damon?
Yeah, well, once again, I'm over in Bend. We have a plethora of amazing restaurants here, and it's been gutting to see the impact that COVID has had on them. My wife and I try to keep eating as much takeout as we can with the France money, and although we do someday hope to go back to France, but I would like to highlight Miyagi Ramen, which is our favorite Bend restaurant these days, which especially in the winter months when it's cold and snowy, having a good bowl of ramen, you just can't beat that.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, shout out to Miyagi Ramen. We're going to have to go check that out, especially when we're over in Bend. All right, Damon, we're going to wrap this up. I appreciate your time, and we'll connect soon, especially in, let's say, June or July.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me, Drew.
You bet. Be well.